Good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the Burns Library at Boston College. We're very pleased to have our first YouTube live webcast here of an event during this pandemic season. And what a better way to do this than to have Éilís Ní Dhuibhne with a book launch today in conversation with James Smith from our English Faculty and Irish Studies program. My name is Christian DuPont and I'm the Burns librarian. What is the Burns Library? It's our collection of rare books, special collections, and manuscripts at Boston College, where we are renowned for our Irish literary collections, historical collections, music collections. I'm looking at my colleague Beth Sweeney, who curates those, and the home of a program that we call the Burns Visiting Scholar in Irish Studies in partnership with our Irish Studies program. I see my colleague Rob Savage, who's our director of the Irish Studies program, and we have brought scholars to campus for residency programs for more than 30 years at this point. So we're delighted to have, again, Éilís here as our writer-in-residence and teaching, and I think we'll hear more about your activities on campus during our conversation here. We have a number of your students here as well. There are about 10 of us in the room. We're thinking about all of you who are joining from the stateside here, especially in Ireland. We feel that much closer to you today because for this 1 week during daylight savings time changes, we're actually 4 hours apart only. And so we're thinking about all of you who are joining us here online. We're going to, after the conversation, have a little time for some question and answers. Some of you will see on your screen a live chat feature, which you can use for that. I'll remind you of that afterward. I also want to recognize, speaking of the presence of Ireland here today, we have our Consul General in Boston, Leisha Moore, who's come over from downtown Boston. She comes many times to our campus events, and we're really pleased. Thank you, and honored to have you here. And not to upstage you, Leisha, but rather to compliment your presidents. The Irish ambassador, Dan Mulhall, really wanted to provide a video greeting on this occasion. And so I'm going to play that now, and you can...
It's one of the great pleasures of mine as Ambassador of Ireland to the United States to travel around this great country and to meet wonderful Irish communities wherever I've been. And also to come across so many people who, whether they're Irish American, Irish, or indeed just have an affinity with Ireland, who treasure and value Irish culture. There's probably nowhere in the United States where that tradition is more apparent than it is in the Boston area. And in Boston itself, I guess the place where that tradition of Irish, of regard and cherishing Irish culture is found most strongly is in Boston College. And I've been to Boston College many times, and of course in the last 6 months I've done quite a number of virtual events with them, and I'm always delighted to do so. I value greatly the work that Boston College does in promoting Ireland and Irish studies and in deepening the understanding here in America of our country, its culture, its people, its history, and so forth. It's a pleasure for me today to speak at the launch of the latest collection by Éilís Ní Dhuibhne. Éilís is one of Ireland's finest writers. She has many, many publications to her name. She is highly regarded in particular in an art form which is one in which the Irish have excelled in particular, and that is the short story. And this, I believe, is her 7th collection of short stories, which is a great achievement in itself. And I know that she's currently a Burns Scholar at Boston College. Again, that's another program which Boston College runs, which is, I think, extremely valuable in fostering deeper links in culture, history, politics, and so forth, and people-to-people links between Ireland and the Boston area, where there's such a strong Irish heritage which goes back centuries. And the Burns Scholars bring that tradition up to date by contributing to the contemporary field of Irish studies at Boston College. I know also from diplomatic sources, which of course, as a diplomat, I would never betray if you torture me, that Éilís Ní Dhuibhne is the world's greatest grandmother. And I know there are many who would claim that title, but my sources assure me that that is the case. So I want to wish Éilís and her colleagues at Boston College and the publishers of her new book all the very best for what I know in Boston you call Pub Day. Now, that might cause a bit of confusion in Ireland, but it's a day when a book is published, and that's of course a great moment for an author like Éilís. And Éilís deserves every success with her latest volume.
Thank you, Ambassador Moll. I think there's going to be no confusion today about what kind of pub day this is going to be. We're thinking again, all of you in Dublin, around Ireland, where you're under a tighter lockdown in the last few weeks. So this is pub day, as in publishing book day. Éilís, Jim, we look forward to your conversation. We have been for quite a while. So take it away. Thank you.
Thanks, Christian. And again, welcome. I'd add my welcome to Christians, to those who are here with us in person, and special welcome to those that are joining us online, remotely, and perhaps especially those in Ireland. We know that you're enduring level 5 restrictions right now, and as you can see, we're doing our best to navigate the current trying circumstances with a brave, if still masked, face. My hope is that this event then, which brings us together to celebrate the creative writer and acknowledge the gifts of the imagination, will make today just that little bit more tolerable. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the renowned Irish writer Éilís Ní Dhuibhne, to recognise her ongoing contribution to Irish letters and to help launch her most recent collection, Little Red and Other Stories, which has been published today by Blackstaff Press. I was first introduced to Eilish's work by my former colleague and teacher, Philip O'Leary, when we read her short story, Midwife to the Fairies. I teach her award-winning novel, The Dancer's Dancing, published in 1999, most years here at BC, including this semester in my graduate seminar, where we were so lucky enough to have Éilís come and visit and talk about her work to my students. And I hosted Éilís back in 2009 here at BC when she first visited us. So given that history of engagement with her work, it has been such a joy to have her here with us this semester as the Burns Visiting Professor in Irish Studies. I know she is busy with her own writing, conducting research on the Irish antiquarian Thomas Crofton Croker in the famed Burns collections here, and teaching her creative writing fiction workshop. But speaking personally, it has been a gift, a salve against the felt isolation of the times, that the two of us have arranged our Tuesday afternoon walks around the reservoir, a chance to chat about things here in the US and at home in Ireland, to discuss our teaching and our respective research and writing. Éilís Ní Dhuibhne was born in Dublin. She was educated at University College Dublin and holds a PhD in Irish folklore. She worked for many years as an archivist at the National Library in Ireland, where, among other feats, she was instrumental in assisting my good friend and fellow graduate of the BC Irish Studies programme, Anne Butler, secure and catalogue the papers of neglected Irish writer Elizabeth O'Connor, Una Troy. She has taught creative writing at Trinity College Dublin, University College Dublin, the Irish Writers' Centre, the Faber Academy, and elsewhere. She's the author of more than 30 books, including her recently published 12,000 Days, a Memoir of Love and Loss, 2018, 7 collections of short stories, several novels, children's books, plays, and many scholarly articles and literary reviews. Her novels include The Bray House, 1990, Fox, Swallow, Scarecrow, 2007, and The Shelter of Neighbours, 2012. She has been the recipient of the Stuart Parker Award for Drama, the Butler Award for Prose, several Oireachtas Awards for novels in Irish, the PEN Award for Outstanding Contribution to Irish Literature, and a Hennessy Hall of Fame Award. Her novel, The Dancer's Dancing, was shortlisted for the Orange Prize in Fiction. Eilish's stories have appeared in many anthologies, including The Long Gaze Back, an anthology of Irish women writers, 2016, and the Granta Book of the Irish Short Story, published in 2010. Her work is widely translated, including into German, Italian, Czech, Japanese, and most recently, Bulgarian. She is a member of Éis Dhona, an ambassador for the Irish Writers' Centre, and president of the Folklore of Ireland Society. Before we turn to our discussion, and I'll hand off to Éilís for a few moments before we start the discussion, Let me just finish with a few insights from critics of Éilís Ní Dhuibhne's contributions to my field of study, our field of study. Writing over 20 years ago, Tina Mahoney presciently recognized what all of us who read her work now more fully appreciate. And I quote, "Éilís Ní Dhuibhne's voice is a distinctive one in today's Ireland. Her trenchant social commentary is delivered with humour and a sprinkle of magic and can be devastatingly on target. It is a sustained and highly imaginative voice that is all the more distinctive in that, while answering a feminist imperative, it is not constrained by contemporary feminist fashion or critical dicta." Fellow writer and novelist, short story writer Mary Morrissey, in her 2017 review of Éilís's selected stories, a copy of which we have here beside me, suggests that she is, and I quote, "a polymath. She writes in English and Irish and across the genres, young adult, crime, and literary fiction in both the short story and novel form. Lightness is what marks out Ní Dhuibhne's style. Lightness coupled with serious intent. She is a deceptive writer, deceptively light in tone, deceptively erudite in her references, deceptively irreverent in her treatment of form." And lastly, Martina Evans, in her Irish Times review of the same collection, identifies what she refers to as, quote, "the Ní Dhuibhne magic," and points to the, quote, "delicious interweaving of old and new" as a hallmark of this writer's work. Evans' review then quotes directly from Eilís's story Illumination, where the narrator wonders, quote, "if it was possible to make new fiction, by which I meant find a new template, a new mold." I'd ask you to join with me in welcoming Éilís. I know Éilís wants to say a few remarks, and then I'll come back and maybe I'll ask some questions. Thank you very much.
I'm smiling under my mask. It's thank you very much, Jim, for that flattering and wonderful introduction. I feel after all this magic and humour, now we're going to come back to earth with a bang. But I'd like to first of all say a huge thank you to, and briefly to a few people. First of all, to Brian Burns, who sponsors the Burns Scholarship, which makes it possible for me to be here. And secondly, to everyone in Boston College who has made my stay here, even during the pandemic, absolutely magical, and well, magical in various ways, and very extremely enjoyable, especially to Jim, Professor Smith, who's doing and our walks on Tuesday afternoons, to Robert Savage, the director of the Irish Studies program, Christian DuPont, who has organized all this, the director of the Burns Library, Suzanne Matson, a colleague in the English department, with whom I also have walks, and oh yes, and Father Oliver Rafferty, who has been very, very helpful to me as well. He can't be here right now. And to my lovely students, a few of whom are here today, Mary and Joe, and the others may be watching. So thank you, everybody, and thank you, my friends. The book is dedicated to my friends, which is a good, wide category of people, and many of them are watching in the US and Ireland.
Of whom there are more than 100 and more online right now.
Good.
And the congratulations and
friends,
well wishes are pouring in over the chat there.
Yeah, yes. And they're scattered around. They're in Ireland, of course, neighbours in Glasnevin, England, Portugal, Spain, Italy, Joanna, hello, not forgetting, of course, Sweden, Denmark, Bulgaria, and possibly a few other places as well. So I really appreciate your support now, as always. And thank you, Ambassador Mulhall, for your nice introduction, and to Leisha Moore, the consul here in Boston, for actually braving coming in person. Thank you. Okay.
Thanks, Éilís. So my last line I quoted from Martina Evans, quoted your own narrator in the story Illumination, if it was possible to make, wondering whether it was possible to make new fiction, by which I mean find a new template, a new world. So I was wondering if we might start by jumping off that assertion and ask you to talk a little bit about your new collection, because that's what you've done. You found something new to write fiction about, and perhaps signal whether or not there are ways in which this work connects to your work of old, but also the ways in which it might be different. Does this collection offer a new template, a new mold for readers of Éilís's work?
I'm not sure about that. I think when I wrote those lines, I was thinking of finding a form which would be a kind of hybrid, maybe between memoir and fiction. This collection of short stories, yeah, some of the stories may be a little bit like that. The collection came when I first thought about, does this collection have a unifying theme? I said, no, it doesn't, because I think one of the great advantages of the short story as a genre, as a form to write in over, say, the novel with which it's usually contrasted, is that you write the stories in a short space of time, at least initially, individually, and you can grab life on the hop, as it were, in a short story in a way which is almost impossible to do with a novel, just because of the relationship of the novel to time, that it's written over quite, a lengthy period. The stories, I think, allow one to I think every short story has its own integrity and is relating to the moment in which it was conceived. I like, Shelley's famous line about the mind in the act of creation is as a fading coal, and the coal kind of fades more and more as you actually do the writing, so that you're getting further and further away from the moment of inspiration. He's talking about the lyric poem, obviously, but I think with the short story, you have more of a chance of kind of holding on to that fire in the writing of the story. So the energy of whatever inspired the story, which would be something outside yourself, kind of resonating with something inside yourself. I think that's what starts it. And I think the stories can do that. So each one has its own integrity. So I thought, no, not much unifying. Then when I looked at the collection, I realized, hey, they are unified. They're unified by me, of course, but they're also unified. They have common themes.
Do you want to talk about
running through them?
A couple of those that you see, and that maybe we can talk about some.
Well, I don't know why I was surprised, but when I look at the collection, and most of in this case, the stories have all been written over a period of maybe 2 or 3 years, certainly from around 2015 to 2018, let us say. So, of course, they reflect concerns in my life, things that interested me at that time, yeah. And those things, surprise, surprise, are getting older, the kind of challenges and maybe opportunities of aging as well. Travel seems to be a theme that comes up time and again in the stories, not surprisingly, since I do a fair amount of traveling. So I think they were the two themes. I suppose I should say that in 2013, just 7 years ago, my husband died rather suddenly, and that was a very traumatic event, of course, for him, but also for me. And for a couple of years following that, I had no real, let's call it a writer's block. I didn't really want to write fiction. So I wrote a memoir, though, because I'm used to writing something. So Then in around 2015, 16, I began to write again. Actually, Sinead Gleeson, who was editing The Long Gaze Back, asked me to write a story. And as a writer, this is something I tell my students. If somebody asks me for a story or anything, I say yes.
Deadlines help.
I always say yes. And then Belinda McKeown asked me for a story for an anthology she was doing, a very good anthology called Kind of Compass. So I wrote another one, and then I was back into it.
Yeah. And I know there were other themes as well, and not that we need a catalogue, but as somebody who came to your work primarily through The Dancers Dancing, a novel that I have this relationship with and has been a constant in my teaching, there's also a recognizable interest in language and language acquisition, characters who learn new languages, who notice dialect, and again, it was interesting to see that as a thread through some of the other stories I read in between times. You had some of stories that I know that you wanted to read excerpts from. Maybe we take a break and
yeah, I'll read. I'll read a little bit, and I'm going to slip off my mask because when I don't do that, my glasses slip off, and then I can't read. So after all that talk about travel and language and everything, I'm going to read in the first instance just 2 pages from a story called Lemon Curd, which is about a woman who travels from the south side to the north side of Dublin, a journey which few people seem to make ever in their lives, apparently. And yeah, there's a little bit, well, actually she's on her way to a class in Russian in this piece of the story, but she's also contemplating aspects of the dialect that she hears around her on the bus. So, I'll cut the bollocks off your mother. The voice is a man's, loud, angry. Miss Moffat hears a lot of interesting mobile conversations on this bus. For example, the day before yesterday, a young man asked someone, "So, do you want that pony?" Pony? The word intrigued her. Miss Moffat had a feeling it might be a slang word for something, some sort of drug, but she didn't really know. She considered the possibility that he was referring to an actual horse. "I'll see you beside the garage at 8 had been his next line. You could have a horse beside a garage or even in a garage out in the western suburbs to which this bus would eventually find its way. Pony could be a little horse or some sort of drug, the transaction of dubious legality in either case. The voice of this man, today's man, is so angry that she's afraid to look too closely at him. Crazy people don't appreciate being looked at, even though they're inviting stares. She saw him getting on the bus, though, and waiting to pay his fare. You could hardly fail to see him. He's dressed all in black, black hoodie, black jogging pants, one black shoe. He has only one foot. His right leg stops at the knee. Something about the way he is dressed suggests to her that it has been cut off, and not by a doctor and not long ago. The bottom of his trouser is wrapped around the place where the short leg ends. It looks like something packed in a shopping bag. Under his oxters, 2 big crutches. Before he made his threat to somebody's mother, or to her mother, or maybe to everybody's mother, she felt sorry for him. But now she mainly feels frightened. He comes down the aisle repeating his threat and sits down beside her. Not exactly beside, just across the aisle. Nevertheless, he's very close. 2 feet separate them, and she doesn't like the look of those crutches. While he was walking, they inspired pity, but now when he's sitting down with the crutches sort of resting in his lap, they look like weapons. Don't be silly. He can't do much harm, him and his one leg. No, the thing is, standing he can't do much harm. But from a seated position, wouldn't it be easy to pick up a crutch and hit somebody with it? The nearest person to him, for example, who happens to be Miss Moffat herself. I'll cut the bollocks off your fucking mother. This is the 3rd time he's expressed this rather strange intention, since Miss Moffat's mother, even if she happened to be alive, which she is not, had never had bollocks. Could it be he's mixing up the word with something else? Breasts, for instance? Boobs would probably be the word he'd use, but that word sounds too harmless and comical. Who knows what he's talking about? The language of this part of the city is still foreign to Miss Moffat. Bollocks might have more than one meaning over here. Miss Moffat is used to hearing words for sexual organs bandied about by angry men on some of the dodgier streets in the inner city. The words of choice refer to female organs, though not boobs. Anyway, now it's not so much bollocks as the word cut that bothers Miss Moffat. She makes a snap decision. Get off the fucking bus. See, she's picking up the local dialect without even trying.
Thanks, Éilís. And that story goes on to talk about men who overstep, and there's things that could be said about that.
Yes, perhaps I will say it because I know Demeter, my wonderful Bulgarian teacher and translator of the stories to Bulgarian, is tuned in. There's a piece about the word prestupnik, which means criminal in Russian and Bulgarian, and means, it's a wonderful word meaning somebody who oversteps the mark. So that's,
thanks for that. So building off that, and just going back to something you intimated earlier, this is a collection at this point of your career, and you signaled aging as a potential theme or connecting theme across, or a current across the collection of stories. I'm wondering, do you think about yourself, or do you see yourself writing in a different way at this point of your career?
I think possibly yes. I think my style and voice is pretty much the same as it has been in the past. I think one's voice as a writer gets maybe just more stronger and more distinctive as one matures or ages. But I think with the stories in this collection, I experimented a little more in a quiet kind of way, in that I haven't written very much about, I haven't located stories or any fiction much outside of Ireland in the past. And this time I thought, why not do that? There are other countries that I spend time in and that I love, Sweden and Bulgaria and other places. So I took the risk of at least locating stories in these places, though usually with a protagonist who is Irish. I also took a few risks writing a kind of story that I would not have written much in the past. Say the kind of story that, Turgenev writes and Chekhov sometimes, where the narrator of the story meets somebody who tells them a story, the tale within a tale. So I've done that with one or two of the stories here. And I've also done something that I have seldom, if ever, done in the past, which is I've written, when you're a writer, people sometimes say, I'll tell you this is a great story for you now. And they tell a great story, but you think, that's a great story for you, but it's, it's probably not going to work for me, and I probably won't write it. But this time, I did that with an anecdote, a story that a friend of mine told me, quite a complex story, and I've been thinking about that. I think that is exactly what I'm talking about when I say you get a story from outside, but it resonates with something inside. I think I grabbed that story because it spoke to something that was going on in my life and inside me at the time. So I've tried those. I would have thought that sort of way of writing might be a bit fakesy or something in the past, but I risked it this time.
Right. Éilís, you mentioned some of the Russian short story writers, Chekhov, and I know you've talked about the influence of Alice Munro, when you visited class. Are there other writers that you find yourself drawn to that are different? Are you influenced by?
I think. Sorry, I'm influenced, drawn to. Alice Munro is my favourite short story writer of all, and I know I have been influenced by her and have learned an awful lot about how to write a short story from Alice Munro's short stories. I mean, other writers that I really like and would love to write like almost are Jhumpa Lahiri. I think some of her stories, the American Indian writer, interpreter of maladies, is an absolutely fantastic story. I like Edna O'Brien, and there's plenty to be learned from Edna O'Brien. She's one of the really great Irish short story writers. Obviously McGahern, good. And I think I write, my sort of short story, and of course, how could I forget the person who taught us in Ireland how to write a short story? It's Joyce and the Dead, and that's my kind of, I think the Dead type of pattern of stories, as I've talked about in class, Mary and Joe will possibly remember this, is the sort of template for how to push a story together that I and many others have been following, so including McGahern, I think. So all of those. William Trevor I like very much too, but he writes in a different, he's a different kind of short story writer.
So maybe, do you want to give us another reading, maybe one of the stories that speaks to or exemplifies some of that experimentation that you were talking about?
Yes, and the one I picked is my Bulgarian story, Nadia's Cake, which was first published in translation in Bulgarian last year in the book Dmitry Kambarov translated. And this is kind of experimentation that I forgot to mention when I was answering. With this story, I did this thing. I wanted to write, I thought I'd like to write a story which has something to do with Bulgaria. And I started with nothing except that, and I decided just to let my imagination run wild. So the result, I think, is a somewhat crazy story, but that was an experiment. I just wanted to, it is a way of writing. So I'll read from the beginning of the story, which is actually the less wild part of it, but anyway, this is where it starts, with a place which is often the starting point for me, I think. Nadia's Cake. A rooster is crowing. The screech spouts up into the hot air and spreads over the red rooftops like the cry of a spirit from another world, a healthy supernatural being. This voice is loud and triumphant as well as shrill. Two old men drinking beer at a plastic table outside a ramshackle shop pay no attention at all. They could be deaf. In silence they sit, whiling away the day, on the lookout for something new, with eyes that expect disappointment. But today there is a new thing. Jen, the stranger who has just come to town. They don masks of inscrutability and take every inch of her in as she walks over the cobbles in her shorts and thick sandals, as she listens to the rooster scream. To her, it's as exotic and delightful as the soft sounds of the language of the village, all shushes and shushes, like the push and slush of the tide on a shingle beach, or the plash of a waterfall in a mountainous pool, more appropriate simile in this inland valley where she's the exotic one, as surprising and welcome as an elephant or a giraffe. The houses on the street are like farmhouses, but all huddled close together as if they are engaged in constant gossip. They are silent, though. A few are holiday homes with pretty terraces, empty now on a Tuesday, waiting for the weekend. A few are inhabited by old people, and they nestle in gardens of flowers and fruit and vegetables with hens running about. Most of the houses look as if they have been dead for a long, long time. Where is everyone? Jen asks Navina, the woman she will stay with, the owner of the guest house. A guest house with one guest and no room for more either. Rose Cottage, it is called. In the city. Navina is chunky, her body wrapped snugly in a dark overall, her white hair cropped. She could be 70 or 80 or 90. As well as the guest house, she runs a shop and a cafe and keeps chickens, goats, a garden where tomatoes, cabbages, onions, herbs and roses grow, also raspberries and peaches and watermelons. Or abroad. Jen knows communism, corruption, emigration, but you have to make conversation. Plus, there's a strict limit to the things she can say or ask, not for reasons of tact, purely linguistic. She can say very little in Navina's language. I get up, I dress myself, I eat breakfast. She's never met anybody who would be interested in the details of her morning routine, although possibly Navina is an exception. It's hard to create an opening, though. Oh yes, I wake up at 7 every morning, really. And what do you do then? I wash myself and brush my teeth. Navina talks, not seeming to care that Jen doesn't understand most of what she's saying, and brings a meal on a tray. Tomatoes and cucumbers, a stew of sausages and beans, red wine, raspberries and yogurt. Food is a language everyone can understand.
Thanks, Éilís. I mean, Bulgaria is somewhat off the beaten path for the Irish short story, but it's interesting to... I mean,
Not now.
Pardon?
Not now.
Not now, exactly. And Jen in this story is like Miss Moffat in the earlier one, who's traveling elsewhere and learning a language. But as far away as Bulgaria might be from Ireland, and maybe it's closer than it once was, you know, you still have versions of domesticity, both Navina and Nadia. You have men and criminality, which we see earlier in the stories. And you have an internally displaced and discriminated community, the traveller community in Bulgaria, which parallels the treatment of travellers historically, the traveller community historically in Ireland. Were you conscious of some of these parallels when you visited or when you wrote about Bulgaria?
Well, I became aware of those kind of parallels. Of course, when I visited Bulgaria, the phenomenon or curse of emigration, many of the young people in Bulgaria left soon after the fall of the wall and the opening up of the Eastern Bloc. And that's obviously something that we're familiar with in Ireland, kind of periods when there's an exodus of youth from the country, which is really a tragic thing, although it has benefits maybe for the places to which they come, which in the case of Bulgaria was to some extent Ireland. Yeah, and then I was very conscious of the, this group of people who are marginalized in Bulgaria, the Roma, the Gypsies, and could see parallels indeed with our traveller community in Ireland. Parallels and differences, of course. So even though, yes, exactly. So even when I was letting my imagination run wild, these were the aspects of Bulgarian life that seemed to pop into my head. So I think, sometimes when you write, it is an exploration of yourself. In fact, and none of these things have ever happened. I mean, they're so outlandish that they couldn't happen. I would hope could not happen to anybody. But as the story gets going, I was reading the other day a great essay by Richard Pine, a friend of mine, called A Writer in Corfu, and Richard writes, either quoting or saying himself, can't quite remember. All writing is about the writer, and if a writer tells you otherwise, they're lying. And I think that is spot on, actually. Yeah. To some, Madame Bovary, same. There's, as Flaubert said, there's an aspect of, the real, true writing, even if it's fantasy, whatever it is, it's really the writer expressing themselves.
Thanks, Éilís. I'm conscious that I want to move shortly to questions that people might have and that are coming in online, but I might ask two others and maybe change of pace slightly. You're here on campus, you're teaching in a classroom at Boston College. You are obviously practiced and experienced in teaching creative writing, but you've talked a few times about the fact that on the far side of the pond, that tends to be graduate students, sometimes in the equivalent of an MA class or an MFA program, and here you're teaching our wonderful undergraduates. What are some of are there other differences? What are some of the rewards and surprises of your semester? What type of work are you doing in the class?
Well, I'm teaching a workshop, a fiction writing workshop. We've focused mostly on the short story, but also on some other kinds of fiction writing so far. The student, I have a kind of mix of students, but mostly younger students, whereas in the postgrad programs in Ireland where I taught, they were, there'll always be kind of a good sprinkling of mature students, as we call them. So here there's one wonderful mature student, but mostly younger people. I don't know that I find, a big difference is I'm teaching on Zoom.
Sure.
That's a big difference. The students are very hard-working. I'm impressed that, because I think I give them quite a lot of reading and especially writing to do, and they always do it, and they get it in time, and all that. And they're fantastic students. I'm not sure that there is otherwise a huge difference, of course, that are of interest to me are actually dialect differences, and sometimes I see something and say, is that, do you really say that here? But I ask my class and they say, yes, we say that, that's okay. Sure. We say lay instead of, of course I know some of them, I'm not unfamiliar with American English, but language is changing all the time, and especially the language of young people. So that's really interesting, and it's a privilege to be introduced to that. And
excellent. So I don't want to stray too far from Little Red, and there are some copies here afterwards, and people will have questions maybe about what else is in the collection. But you're also involved in another project which is soon to be published. It's in the very late stages, a collection that you were editing but also contributing to, entitled Look, It's a Woman Writer, Irish Literary Feminism, 1970 to 2020, forthcoming from Arlen House. Do you want to talk a little bit about that project and how you see it, this being the right time for a project like that?
Yeah, this is a very exciting book. It's an anthology of 21 essays by Irish women writers. There is one American writer, a kind of honorary Irish person who's been over with us for a long time. And the criterion for inclusion was that you would have to be over 60 when you wrote the essay. I had the idea that people who were born around the time I was born, women, were born at a lucky time to, if they wanted, as I say, if they had a pen in their cradle, because even though the 50s was kind of, it seems retrospectively anyway, a depressed period in Irish life. It was that, yeah. Poverty, emigration, everything. It was all bad in the 50s, and censorship of literature was really strong. And there were not very many women writers at all. But as these writers came of age and began as these women who wanted to be writers, I mean, an aspect of the book is that they nearly all say they wanted to be writers when they were children. And I think, hey, that's probably how it often has been in the past with girls and women, but they don't go on. But the difference is that this group kept at it, so they're still writing when they're in their 60s or as pub day gets further away, they'll soon be 70 or 80 if it doesn't hurry up. But I think the book will be published just after Christmas. Yeah, I thought it was a good time because we're very conscious of a kind of new wave of young women writers in Ireland, which is fantastic. You know, the Sally Rooney phenomenon, just to use shorthand. But sometimes you kind of get the impression, if you were around in the 1980s, that, hey, folks, we were doing this sort of stuff back then. We were discovering feminism. We were saying we need to, you know, the women's voice has to be heard in Irish letters and so on. So I wanted to document that, and I thought, what better way than to, you know, most of them are still there and they can write an essay about themselves and their writing careers. And so it's the story from the horse's mouth or the mare's mouth.
Yeah, I've seen the table of contents. It's a who's who. I've read the introduction, and it was eye-opening in some ways. It also helped me read back your story from Little Red, the story White Skirt, because on one level that story might seem just to have a tincture of being anachronistic or set back in the day, but the issues that it foregrounds, the issue of shame within the Irish family, our diaspora, immigration as a way in which we lost people and people were sent abroad. I mean, it was so on the moment, given what's been happening in Irish society in the last week.
Yes.
But I do think cataloguing and providing a space and a forum to bring all of those voices who were talking about these things in the 70s, in the 80s, and the 90s. I have to say I'm really looking forward to delving into that collection when it appears, and hopefully that'll be soon.
Yes, I think it will be a really important collection and sort of witness to this particular history. Because, I mean, my impression of the history of Irish literature since, I mean, I published my first story in 1974, so like it's ages ago, and it was just such a lucky time to be to be writing. I think I probably say this in my own essay there. Possibly, if it hadn't been for, you know, the introduction of feminism, our consciousness were raised, we began to be aware, okay, there are a few Irish women writers like Edna O'Brien, who was treated very badly, but succeeded as a writer, obviously. Kate O'Brien, who did it as well, helped to be living abroad, I think.
Jennifer Johnson.
Yeah, Jennifer Johnson, of course, yeah. There were a few, but there weren't really all that many, like all the big names, well, they're big names, but mostly it's a literature dominated by men. And I think if that had continued, and if we didn't have this kind of change and the women's presses like Garland House and Attic Press and Virago in England and so on and so forth, that somebody like me who wanted to write when she was 8 or 9 and, you know, published stories in her teens and 20s, I might have just stopped, you know, because life gets in the way and plenty to do apart from write. But because just at the right time in the 1980s, I became aware there's something missing, and I almost have a responsibility to Irish literature to go on writing. That sounds rather arrogant, but it was no longer just about me. It was so I went on, and so have these 21 writers, and there are many more who, you know, could be in the anthology, should be in that anthology, and aren't for one reason and another. So everything, we were lucky, you know, things changed, and especially for fiction writers, I think, so that nowadays it's, you know, we're normal people, Irish women writers.
So thank you so much. I'll hand off to Christian. I might just, in that context, in that list of names, maybe it's appropriate, I hope it is, to just remember Julia O'Whalon, who would also have been that generation who we just lost yesterday. So
I was going to mention that at the end of the hour, and one of our commenters just mentioned her passing as well today.
And I have one last request, Christian. Joseph Nugent, our good colleague, asked for an announcement, so maybe I'll do that at the end.
I'll do that, yes. So this hour is going to end too soon, but there's another hour that'll be coming on Friday afternoon, and that'll be 8:30 Dublin time, 4:30 here. And I will put at the in a moment here the Zoom URL for a series that's called The Irish Influence. And so Éilís is our special guest for that in conversation with Joe Nugent and Mike Cronin from our Boston College, Ireland. And again, I'll put the URL for that in afterward. And of course, you can also just write to me for any follow-up on this. My contact information is in the Zoom, in the YouTube live area there. So, Éilís, you are so loved. We knew that already, but the comments that are coming in, which I've assured everyone you will have a chance to read afterward, are just lovely.
Thank you.
All right? And there's more of us here at Boston College. Love you even more now. Your students alluded here. One of the questions I have that's come in here is from Desmond. He asks the significance of the title. So I suppose it's like a record album, right? You have a number of stories, and Little Red is the name of one of the stories, but maybe you'd like to tell us how you put that one first, or how you came with the title of that. So.
Well, it's a reference to Little Red Riding Hood, and so the story is a sort of grown-up version of Little Red Riding Hood. That's where it comes from. A friend of mine suggested that I call it Little Red, or EAD, but as in a short story is a little read, and also they're not read as much as they ought to be. But the publishers, Patsy Horton at Blackstaff, didn't think that was a great idea. But so it's Little Red Riding Hood, yeah.
Do we have questions from anyone here?
So Suzanne has a question.
Yeah, Suzanne.
Éilís and Jim, thank you. That was fascinating. When I read your memoir recently, 12,000 Days, I was struck by the confidence of the young woman who started her writing career and did it with aplomb, and despite the pulls of many directions, raising children and so forth, just sort of steadily kept at it and assumed that that career would go forward and that she would make time for it. And it was interesting to hear you say just now that in the 80s you felt a sort of special responsibility to sort of keep going as a woman writer. I'm wondering how dangerous were any falterings along the way for you as a writer, and what role other women writers may have played in keeping you going, or a communal sense of the mission?
Yeah, that's a very good question and point, Suzanne. I think, well, I mean, for me, you know, all things content me from this craft of verse, as Yeats says. There were many temptations from the craft of writing, just ordinary life, you know, falling in love, falling out of love, getting married, getting children, working full time. I mean, I sometimes when I look back, I wonder how on earth did I do it? But I just did. But other women writers were very important, because something that happened in the mid-80s coincided with the time I was a young mother and so on, is that we began to have workshops for writers in Ireland, really almost the first time. They were a new phenomenon. There was no such thing as creative writing or anything in those days. And there were workshops specifically for women writers organised by the Arts Council and Ireland House. And gosh, some of my friends from those workshops way back are, I think, here today in looking at this event. And we have been very encouraging to one another, yeah. So that was important as well, the sort of sense of solidarity with other writers, indeed.
Thank you. Anyone else on the other side of the room or this side? Or online? I'm seeing so many congratulations, but not questions here.
Leisha?
Oh, Leisha, there we are. Good.
Thanks, and thank you for this discussion. It's really interesting. I was just interested to hear a little more about the process of writing a collection of short stories. When you're writing your stories, I mean, are you consciously conceiving of them as a collection that will all be put together, or just each one just stand on its own?
Yeah, that's a good question. In this instance, no. Each one is written individually, and then at a certain point, pull them together into the collection. So I didn't set out to write a collection. But I mean, at this stage, I know that eventually my stories will be, I will collect the stories into a book and a volume. One of my previous collections, The Shelter of Neighbours, I tried to theme that in using the device of having many of the characters in the stories living on the same street and interacting a bit with one another. But I think I probably did that after I'd written the stories, because I think those devices are good, they work, but they are a little bit tricksy, and I'm not enough of a Joycean to know this, though somebody knows. There's nothing that is not known about Joyce. But my guess is that Dubliners, that he used that title for the collection. I mean, the stories were written over quite a long time. Several years. So, and I think, hey, Joyce, he's so clever. That's a great title, because, Dublin is a good big place with lots of different characters, and it gives you scope. So, so no, I didn't, Leisha. But as we were saying, I think because they're written during a limited period of a couple of years, they are thematically kind of connected as well. Whereas, somebody's first collection of short stories, like I remember my first collection which came out, they were stories which had been written, from the time I was 19 to I was about 32 or something. And like the stories could have been nearly all written by a different person. And it's often like that with a person's first collection. But at this, as you go on, they get more samey, I suppose.
I might ask myself, if anything of Boston and your experience here in Chestnut Hill, being the neighborhood around Boston where we are, is sneaking its way into your consciousness and into your stories. It's remarkable that you were able to actually come. I mean, it was so touch and go into the last minute. Now you find yourself here, and it was an anxious arrival in some ways, but now you've been with us for a few weeks. That's
right. It's been quite an adventure, the whole experience, the great experience. I am writing while I'm here, so yeah, I think the answer is yes, it will find its way, so watch out.
Anyone else here or online? We have a couple minutes left, 3 or 4. There we are. Oh, you're going to fight it, Suzanne. All right. We'll give this one to Rob here, and they'll come back to you. I think about that.
Hey, thanks, Éilís. Just a question about writing in the time of a pandemic. How do you think the pandemic will influence writers? I mean, do you think we'll be reading novels and short stories about this time 5 years from now, 3 years from now?
Well, it's hard to make predictions, but I would say yes, because I think this pandemic is one of those, it's a pandemic. It's one of those phenomena that affects absolutely everybody in the world, really, in some way. History and the personal are intersecting now for all of us all the time. Some more directly and tragically, for some more directly and tragically than for others, but we're also affected by it. I mean, at the beginning, I was teaching in an online course in the Irish Writers Centre, and I said to my students, please do not give me a story about COVID. But now I'm thinking, no, we should. I think the thing about something like COVID is, though, that it is setting, it's historical setting rather than, I don't think a story will be, fiction is always about people, or almost always. It's going to be about characters interacting, relationships, all those things that we write about when we write stories. So I think COVID and the pandemic will be there as a setting, yeah. And I would want to document it, personally, because I like documenting things that are happening.
All right, on that, I think we can combine two questions. Suzanne, maybe we'll hold yours since you're here. We'll do that afterward in person. But there's one question about just the future of the short story in Ireland, but maybe you can tie that to this one here that Lucy asked. Do you set out with a plot, or does that unfold as your characters develop in the short story?
I'm very bad at plot, so no, I never set out with a plot, actually, in short stories. With a novel or a book for young people, I would organise at least a tentative plot before I get going. But with the short stories, no, they kind of unfold, and I impose, a plot of kinds emerges as I write the story.
And you feel the short story as a genre has a future in Ireland and elsewhere? As long as you're with us, right? That is a big question.
Well, it's been there for a long. Yes, I would think so. Absolutely. I mean, it's never been. There's hardly ever been a great period for the short story. Maybe with the possible exception of kind of the end of the 19th century in Russia when Chekhov and people like that were writing. But it's always been a bit of an underdog in the literary world. But it hangs in there. A bit like Irish itself, the language, it's not going away.
Well, there are a lot of themes because we really focus on short stories, a little bit on novels. Of course, again, Friday, we gave some indications. Again, it's in the chat there for those of you who are joining online, or just simply write to me. I'll provide information how to join the conversation on Friday evening. We can maybe pick up some of the rest of your writing that which covered. Jim, thank you so much for
a great pleasure.
preparing this time with us. It's great as a colleague. And Éilís, again, you are so loved. And I can't wait to share all the wonderful comments and congratulations on the launch of your book with us this afternoon. So,
Thank you.
thank you. Thanks to all of online.